talk about some of the work that I've done over a course of 20 plus years in this arena, where we bring in behavioral science and take that behavioral science into how do you engage and motivate your employees. And specifically, we're going to be talking about some of the behavioral science principles and how you can apply that to your reward programs. And kind of some of your communications as well. So we'll do that. So one of the things I want to talk about in thinking about this is that we are human beings across a variety of different skills, right? So we have our personal life, we have our family life, we have work life. And different things, we each have a different personality profile. That personality profile is an interesting component because personality is pretty consistent. We also have a motivational profile. Now that motivational profile is one of those things that how are we as an individual motivated? The interesting thing about a motivational profile though is that it's different, it's different in our personal life than it is in our work life. And we have different components of it. It is also not very, it's very fluid. So in other words, the motivational profile that I have today, what motivates me today, can actually change pretty significantly tomorrow. Personality isn't that way, right? Personality is pretty consistent throughout. So as we're thinking through this, just take into account some of those different things. The other interesting piece I just want to talk about is the component of how we think about ourselves and how we think about some of the motivational elements that we bring in. And I just want to make sure that as you listen to me talk, that the things that I'm saying, try to apply them to yourself, but also think about this in the general. Because again, any one of these things may or may not apply to you, but in general they typically apply. All right. So I've been doing this for over 20 years. Like I said, I have a background, so I always like to tell people I have a marketing undergraduate, I have an MBA, so I have this business side of me, but then I got my Ph.D. in IO psychology. IO psychology is basically just understanding it. I didn't want to sit down with people on a couch and kind of hear about their parents and various different things, so as we said, we deal with normal people just in an organizational perspective. And so that's what we're going to do. And so with that, let's just kind of start moving on. So what is behavioral science? Behavioral science is any of the disciplines around science that focus in on human behavior. So that is psychology, of course, sociology, neurology, but it also includes economics, behavioral economics, a number of those things. And so when we talk about being a behavioral scientist, my background is in the psychology side, but I also study all of those other things. And that's what we try to apply to this. And one of the things that we know from behavioral science is that we think about how people behave and what actually drives that motivation, drives that behavior. And we like to think of ourselves as rational, but what behavioral science shows or indicates is that we're not always as rational as we think, right? And that we often have certain things that we think should motivate us, but we don't. And if we were perfectly rational people, if we were robots where it was just plug and play, none of us would ever be overweight, we wouldn't overeat, we wouldn't overindulge in anything, but we don't. We don't understand our own motivations as well as we like to think we do. And so that's an interesting component of it. And this is just a way to kind of talk about this. So how many people, if you had to rate yourself as a driver, how many people say that they are in that top 10 to 20% of drivers? Anybody feel that they're a really good driver? All right. All right, good. How many in that next 10 to 20%? All right. All right. How about just above average? Everybody, how many people here are above average, right? Yeah, so it's interesting. When people ask that, 90% of people believe that they're in the top 50%, which obviously can't be true. But we have this self-idea of how good we are in different things. But this is just one of those factors. Here's just a quick. So everybody, just raise your hands as high as you can. Okay. All right, raise it higher. Raise it a little bit higher. All right, $20 for the person who has the highest hand. $20. Who's going to get their hand highest? Oh, there we go. We got $20. I got $20 right here. Keep going. Let's see.
Okay, Jennifer, I can have a chair. 10.
There we go. Yeah.
I did it first. No, I'm just kidding.
Here we go. There we go.
Split it.
This is for you. So the interesting piece there is, and you guys demonstrated it interestingly, but I've done that multiple times, and every single time when I just say, raise your hand as high as you can, and then I say, raise it higher, everybody's hand goes a little bit higher. You were supposed to raise your hand as high as you could the first time. Why when we ask you a little bit more, you raise it a little bit higher? And when I offer up the cash, people stand on the chair. I did this, and I was just in Kuwait last week, and I did this very thing with 120 HR managers. We had people standing on top of the tables, right? And so
That was my next move.
Yeah, that was the next
I didn't want to flip the table.
Yeah, well, there we go. They were they got up on top of the table. And so you can understand from a motivational perspective, there's different, if we all were supposed to go, we all go and we do our job, right? We have roles, we have responsibilities. We all are supposed to raise our hand as high as we can all the time, but we don't. And so we need to understand, so what are those motivational? So just asking to raise it a little bit higher actually is a motivational component, right? You can get people to be more motivated by paying attention and pushing on that, right? Giving it a bigger challenge. How high can you go is even there's another thing. Offering some extrinsic motivation is even a different piece. And so all of those factors play into this. So there you go. Good job. Nice job on the 20. I should have that in my pocket instead. So what are some of the switches that organizations typically pull to motivate their employees? Just from the audience, what do you think? What are some of the things, what are some of those levers that organizations pull to motivate their employees? Bonuses. Cash.
Cash is king.
Cash is king. Oh, I've heard that a lot. What else?
Flexibility.
What?
Flexibility.
Flexibility.
Time off.
Time off. There's lots of different things. So typically, right, this is an interesting thing because as an organization, you have a number of different levers that you pull. The fact of the matter is that most organizations I work with, cash is king, bonus, money, those are those things. And those are the levers that organizations are really, really good at. And if you ask employees what they want from an incentive or a variable reward, 70 to 80% of the time they will always say cash. So in pretty much every survey that I've ever seen, you're going to get 70 to 80% picking cash, which is kind of expected, right? Cash is, from an economic perspective, is fungible. Basically, that means that I get cash, I can buy the merchandise or the trip or whatever that other reward is, and I can spend it on my own if I wanted to or not, right? But the fact of the matter is that money is not the only motivator that we have, as we showed, right? We could just ask people to raise their hands higher, they raise their hands higher. There's other things that we can do. And oftentimes, money's not the best motivator. And so for instance, is anybody here a marathon runner? Anybody ever run a marathon? Oh, congratulations. So you ran the marathon because you had a ton of cash on the line at the end, right? You were going to win thousands of dollars for putting in. How much did you guys train?
A lot.
Yeah. Hours, and is it fun training? I mean, did you love getting up at whatever time and running out in the cold and various different things? No, there's obviously a different motivation to get up and do that. You got a t-shirt, right? T-shirt's awesome.
No, we actually have to pay to run.
You're actually paid to run, right?
To run.
So there's obviously some other motivation besides money that gets people going and doing things that, I always tell people, hey, the first person to run a marathon, they ran the marathon, they dropped down and died afterwards, right? That was the Greek kind of mythology around that. So why are you guys doing this? And it's an element of intrinsic motivation that goes along with that, and other things about who you are as an individual in various different pieces. So with that, I'm going to go back to what I talked about before, where it said, I said most people prefer cash, right? When you ask. There's a researcher out there, Scott Jeffrey, really interesting guy, and he's done some really good research on this. But he has this component. It's called the say-do problem. And basically what he talks about there, kind of the research shows, is that when what we say motivates us, doesn't actually drive the same behavior. It doesn't necessarily drive the behaviors as much as others. And so this thing that he says here, choice and the decision to take action are separate psychological transactions. So what we say we want to do or how we're motivated is actually different from what actually gets us to take a step, okay? And this is an interesting study that he did. So, group survey basically said, I would prefer to receive cash value of a prize rather than the prize itself. And if you look at this, that the strongly agree was 36%, and actually above the top it was well over 50% said that. So you got that component, right? When they did a study that had cash and a non-monetary award. These said this multiple times. One was a trip to Hawaii, the other was some merchandise, cash, and various different things. Cash did improve performance. 14%. These were based on 3-month incentive programs. So you had a 3-month program to increase your performance. 14%, not bad, right? When you offered cash and merchandise, it was 39, 14, almost 40%, almost 3 times the performance lift. Which doesn't make sense. If people said, I would prefer the cash over the prize. If you prefer the cash, you should be more motivated by that cash. But we're not. That's that say-do problem. So you need to understand when you're thinking about how you're motivating your people, sometimes asking them is really important. And asking them, particularly if you're talking about recognition, right? What type of recognition? Do people want to be recognized in front of others? Or do they like to be recognized for a great job kind of personally, right? Because there is a huge component from being in front of people can actually be a demotivating perspective, and so you don't want to do that. But if you ask them what they want to be rewarded with, take that with a grain of salt, all right? And think about, and I often talk to people in the meeting with science, we like to do studies, right? And various different things, but you can look at different things like that. So, I want to talk about some of the motivational perspectives, right? And there is a model of motivation, and again, I'm sorry, I get geeky over this stuff, so if I start getting way down in the weeds, just say, somebody raise their hand and go, Kurt, just bring it back up, because I'll go off on this. 4-drive model of employee motivation, developed by 2 guys from Harvard, Lawrence and Noria. Noria is now the dean of the business school. Lawrence, however, passed away in 2010. But they came up with this model. Basically what they were saying is that, look, there are 4 drives that people have that really are the underlying drives from an employee perspective, what drives you here. We've done some work. I was introduced to this model back in 2008, and subsequent to that, myself and my company, we've done some research and we've done some real-world things. So this isn't the actual model that they had. They only had, it was, I'll talk about it later, but we modified a few of the definers on here. So the first drive is acquire and achieve. So we're driven to acquire things, resources, pleasures, and status. Makes sense. That's the lever that we typically tend to pull. It's what you guys talked about. Money, bonuses, title, corner office, all of those types of things. We do a lot for that. And it's one of the aspects that even when we get, there's research or kind of some theories out there that, hey, once you have a certain amount, money no longer motivates. That's really not true. We've seen money motivates. It becomes, in other words, if you have a $5,000 bonus for somebody making $50,000, and that same $5,000 bonus for somebody making $200,000, you know what? That $5,000 for the $200,000 obviously has a much less motivational goal. And in reality, if you took that 5% is 10% of 50,000, if you took 20,000 of 200, it still doesn't have the same motivational impact as the 5,000 for the 50. So that you have to actually increase the percentage of their overall thing in order to get the same amount of motivational impact that you have from a monetary perspective. But it still works, right? Bill Gates, you know, richest man in the world, still motivated to a certain degree by getting more money in various different things. Maybe not Bill Gates, but all right, one of the, you know, there you go, thank you. Billionaires are still trying to get additional money, and they're motivated by that. Now, sometimes that's a different aspect because it's a status component as opposed to the actual money. It's like how much I have compared to you, but that's a whole separate part. So with that then, we're not just motivated by money, so we're motivated by other things. And so we're social creatures. And so we're motivated to also bond and belong, which is, in other words, we're driven to create positive relationships, engage, and fit in. So we are not the lone cowboy out on the range. That's that mythology of how we kind of operate. We're actually really social creatures. And we will do a lot in order to maintain and to feel like we fit in and that we're bonding with the people that we work with. What's really interesting in all the companies that I work with, this is oftentimes, it's natural, it's inherent in how people manage, but it's not purposeful. And so think about how you work with your team. Think about how your organization is structured. There are natural occurrences of trying to get people to interact with each other, you know, to connect, to have those personal bonds. But they're not always very purposeful in their design, nor are they purposeful in how they're actually implemented. And there's not necessarily designs on this. So it's a really interesting thing. And in fact, some incentive designs are actually counterintuitive for this. I worked with a big pharmaceutical company, Eli Lilly. This has been published work. I did a presentation on it, so I can say their name. But we worked with them, and they were working with their incentive program. Their incentive program competed, you know, top performer against top performers against different things, which actually, when we did the research, led to people saying, I'm not sharing my best ideas with anybody else, because if I share it with you, right, you might take that and leap above me and win the award, or, you know, get the bigger bonus, or whatever that would be. And so when we redesigned their component, we still had some individual elements in it, but we had a bigger component based on team performance and working as a team, and how do you incentivize the team in order to drive that performance. And so thinking about your incentives and how you motivate people, there's an element of bonding and belonging, and how do you encourage people to do that. And that can be as simple as, you know, going out and having your team share coffee together or go out for drinks. It can be components about, you know, doing mentoring programs. It can be job sharing. It can be a variety of different things. But if you get people to feel like they're part of a group, you're a much stronger component. Third one is challenge and comprehend. This is an interesting one. So we're driven to achieve goals, attain mastery, learn, improve, and create. Right? Who plays video games? Anybody play video games? We have a older demographic in here.
I try to, but
yeah.
It's just hard to find.
But most people, if you think about this, so if you think about video games, you know, you go through levels, right? And at some point you master that first level, and you can just get through it easy as peasy, right? You wouldn't continue playing that game if that was all you did, because it was too easy, I got through. So every level gets a little bit harder, and it creates another level of challenge. I talk about this as my 3-year-old. So my daughter is, oh my gosh, she's 8 now, and my son is 12. But when my daughter was about 2, Mom was gone. We were going to a birthday party, and of course, since Mom was gone, we were running late, right? Because I have to get the kids ready and doing everything. And this was right when my daughter was learning how to tie her shoes or put her shoes on, and they were the Velcro shoes, right? So they weren't even tie shoes. But how long does it take a 2-year-old to put on shoes? Anybody have little kids? About 20 minutes, right? Yeah, it's like a long time, and we're already late. We still have to go get the present, I think, you know, we're doing all the stuff. And so I just go down and I try to, you know, put on her shoes for her. What do you think her response is? Shaking heads. No, no, Papa, no, I'm going to do this, right? Because for her it was this challenge. And it's like intense in trying to get that foot in the shoe and get the Velcro. I mean, there was no way I was going to be able to, unless I forcibly just pushed it on her and said no. She was adamant about it. So 5-10 minutes later, you know, her shoes are on, we're ready to go. Now, my son, who at the time I think was 6, right? If I would have offered to put his shoes on, he would have been, sure, you know, he's lazy, you know, it's like, Papa, yeah, put my shoes on, you know. So the challenge, you know, that motivation is always there. Our challenges change. And so how do you put your challenges together, and how are you setting goals? How are you designing roles for people? And particularly if you're talking about rewards and incentives, what's the rule structure? How do people earn those rewards? How do they earn that thing? Making sure that there's a challenge. Now, it's an interesting piece. If the challenge is too hard, people zone out. So you can't make it so it feels like the perception that they can't achieve. You need to make sure that the perception is that, yes, I can achieve that. All right, last one. This is the one that oftentimes people have a hard time grasping. So it's define and defend. And the way that Lawrence and Maria talked about this is that we used to be tribal by nature, and we would defend the tribe, right? Defend the tribe from outward threats. But we're not tribal in nature. We have our family, we have community, and you know, religious organizations we feel part of. But our work and organizations that we work for, the teams that we work in, can kind of be a surrogate tribe. So if you can get your organization for your employees to start feeling like they're part of something that's bigger than them, you have a strong motivation. And this one is one of those really subtle motivational components, but I've seen it be really impactful. And it's interesting because the define part of this is really about your individual self-identity and your purpose, and how does that align with the organizational goals and the organization's mission. And so if you can make that alignment and get that going, then you have a really strong component. I usually talk about this as the cocktail kind of test, right? If you're out at a cocktail party and there's a lot of people that you maybe not know, you hear somebody talking about your company and they're saying something disparagingly about it, or maybe not even disparagingly, but just kind of neutral or almost negative. Do you go and say, hey, no, I work there and this is really how it is, this is really good? Or do you just kind of keep, you know, have your cocktail and just kind of go off and walk to the side? Are you going to defend the honor and the reputation of the organization, or are you just going to slope down because you don't want to put up that component, right? So, again, in Kuwait, when I was at this session, one of the best examples I saw was we had one of the presenters was the HR VP of HR, wasn't over the old HR, it's a specific of HR, and I forget what I was from Facebook. It's right when Zuckerberg was presenting to Congress. And so he was, you know, asked about it. He was adamant about how Facebook was really positive and all the positive things, but he was really positive about that, and it was one of those components. So I want to talk about some different pieces here, and so there's some behavioral science principles. So there's an element called hedonic motivation. Basically, hedonic or luxurious awards, not hedonism. Hedonic is a technical term that they use in the research that talks about luxurious things that you wouldn't normally buy, or you might have a little bit of guilt for buying something like that, are more equivalent and more motivating than equivalent cash or other rewards. What's really interesting about this is that because these types of rewards don't result in indulgence, basically this guilt that we have. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that as we go on there. But the other aspect of that is luxurious rewards actually resonate in different parts of our brain. And so when we think about luxurious awards, there's this component that they actually have a more vivid part of our brain. They actually get processed more in the left-hand I'm getting my left and right brain stuff. Anyway, you have a stronger retention with them. And so they're actually more motivated. They will actually stay with people longer, and you'll have a much more impressive component, whether that be merchandise, whether it be travel, whether it be whatever. I worked with one company, and this seems interesting because it doesn't necessarily seem like it's a hedonic motivation. We had a list of 8 different awards up there. Everything from like a barbecue kind of grill set to individual travel. They could go away for a weekend to big screen TVs. The number one chosen award, and we always had to fight with the incentive director on this, was a set of matching high-end washer and dryer. And you think about it, you go, well, why would that doesn't seem hedonic. The fact of the matter is, it was because it was luxurious, because it was high-end. It was like the steam cleaning kind of component. So things that, like if you went out to buy a washer and dryer on your own, yeah, you probably just get the regular, maybe lower end model. This is the high-end, kind of luxurious one, various different things. And so it was actually it was kind of perceived by them as a luxurious and hedonic reward. So it's not always those things that we think of like, oh, it has to be the splashy things, but it's things that we wouldn't normally spend our money on, or we would have some guilt, like, wow, I should have spent that extra $500 on the kids, savings for college, right, or the utility bill that we have to pay. But that's a different piece. And actually, that gets into mental accounting. I'm not going to go over this very quickly, but economically speaking, money is fungible. I talked about that. It can be spent on anything, so it shouldn't matter. But in reality, what we do, Richard Thaler and Danny Canahan, 2 behavioral economists, talked about this, where we tend to put people, when we get a chunk of money, we kind of do some mental accounting, right? We put some of it aside for savings, some of it for the utility bill, and the rest, this is the fun part, right? So if I get a $5,000 bonus, that bonus gets chunked up into these different parts. If I get a $5,000 trip, hey, it's a $5,000 trip. I don't feel guilty about not spending that $3,000 and putting it in for the child savings account. And so again, there's that lack of indulgence or lack of guilt that comes in, and it's called justifiability. And so again, Scott Jeffrey, the gentleman that I talked to, that researcher up there, he talked a lot about this and has done some really interesting research on justifiability of awards. All right, so that was kind of talking about how do you pick which award you want, various different pieces. Any questions on that? We can talk about that more. So how do you improve rewards? So in any type of experience or travel event, there's this element called peak end rule, where people judge an experience by its peak, so the most pleasurable part, most memorable part of an experience, and the end. All right? It's not on average how it is. So if you looked at this, these two charts, where this is a pleasure rating and this is over time, right? And you look at these two, if you were to just gauge on an average, right? The average pleasure of this one is higher than this one. This goes down here and different things. Peaks are about the same, but the ending here is higher. So if you were to ask a person which one they would like, after the fact, which was better, they would say this one. Even though on average, you know what? It was just kind of and here it was like, oh, this is pretty good, good. Oh, great. Oh, not so good. Kind of different things. On average, that one's better, but this one gets more. So if you're designing an award trip or award experience, we're doing a lot of work with companies now on looking at their experiences, and even if it's a learning experience, educational experience, make sure that you focus in on how that ends, right? There's another thing, there's a component about how it starts too, and how it starts actually influences how people are feeling throughout it, not necessarily the memory of it, but if you start low, there's an anchor component. We'll talk about that later. But peak end rule is really interesting. So even from the perspective, from a travel perspective, which Carousel does, thinking about what's that last thing that people do, like even how do you get to the airport, right? How do you do? Think about the Sun Country folks who might have had a fantastic vacation down in Cabo, right? they're not going to remember that trip as being fantastic because of the component that went on with that, right? So think about when you're designing your trip or an experience, something like that. There's also this component called social proof, or the bandwagon effect. So the tendency of people to assume the actions of others are reflected the correct behavior in a given situation. It also gets into how people perceive a situation. So has anybody been in a hotel room where you've seen the little note in the bathroom that says, "We conserve water, you know, hang your towels up and we won't wash them, leave them on the floor and we'll wash them," right? There's been really interesting research that says if you actually have that thing and say, you know, 80% of the people at this hotel, you know, hang their towels up. The percentage of people in that room that hang their towels up is actually higher than if you just say, you know, leave it up. It's social proof. This is the right thing to do. Solomon Asch, which you guys, anybody took sociology or psychology 101 in college, did some really interesting research. So if you've seen this, this is interesting. So basically back in the 50s, he did this thing where he had a group of people together and he said, here's a test line, all right? Now here are 3 options. Which line matches that? And so if you ask people just normally, 100% or close to 100% of the time, they always matched it up right. What he did, though, is he made it where they were gathered around the table. There were 8 people around the table. 7 of them were conspirators. 7 of them were in. And so after the first couple times, and he showed different lines like this, and like on the 3rd or 4th time, all the conspirators would say in this, like, "Oh, it's B." And so the first person goes, "What is it?" And you go, "B, B, 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 B," until it gets around to me, and I'm looking at that going, "B? No, it's not. Not even close." But 75% of the time, people conform with what people say. Because they're going, all right, what's wrong with my eyes? What you know, they self-doubt. So it's a really strong motivational component. So if you can show some social proof in how people are doing things, and particularly if you're talking about what they need to do in order to achieve the goal, right? What are the behaviors? And you're showing people the right behaviors. It's really powerful. Contrary to this is I was working with a company once, and they had an executive. We were working on their 401k plan, working with them on how do you get more people involved in the 401k plan, and we put all these kind of neat things in there. There's a big splash. The president got up in front of a couple hundred people in the audience, and we didn't coach the president on what he should say, and he started berating the audience. He said, "We have one of the worst in the industry. You know, less than 20% of people are doing the maximum match. You guys need to do better." All of this stuff. Which you go, all right, that seems right. He's trying to motivate these people, saying we're not doing as good. In retrospect, what he ended up doing is just socially justified, basically saying social proof. Oh, I'm not putting the full matching in there. Well, nobody else is either. We're less than 20%. So all of a sudden, the social proof is on the wrong behavior as opposed to the right behavior. And so we had to do a bunch of extra work in order to really show how that didn't work. Another thing is called idiosyncratic fit. And this is really interesting from the perspective that when we feel we have a unique advantage in a program, or that program is tailored specifically to us, we're more motivated by it. So this is Rand Kivitz, researcher at Case Western, did this likelihood of joining a credit card program. All right, and he had a couple different things. So you could get a credit card that had low cost of entry. In other words, you paid $5 for the credit card. Or you could get a high cost entry, which you paid like $75 for the credit card, right? But then he did a really interesting thing. He said, so just like, what's the likelihood of joining on that, right? So he also had this point component, right? Where for every $1 you spend, you get double points that then you can redeem for some merchandise. And so as you would, think, low cost entry fee, yeah, likelihood is about 3. When it's high cost, it goes down, even more. What would happen though if you said, hey, instead of double points in all grocery stores and gas chains, that you got to pick your grocery store and your gas chain. So it was only, so for instance, Super America is the gas place near me. I'd only get double points in Super America. Economically speaking, you would say that's even worse, because if I'm driving and hey, there's no Super America and I'm near empty, you have to stop at Mobile, well, I'm not getting double points for that. But what he found is that when you actually doubled your points in there, people were more likely in the low cost, but even like 3 times more likely to buy in the high cost. Very hard to explain rationally. But what they did in the qualitative research afterwards is say, these people felt, because it's specific to me, because it's my gas station and my grocery store, and because it's select, because I'm limiting it, right? Not everybody's going to be there. It's more specific to me, and I am more likely to win, even though that's not rationally makes sense. Does that everybody understand that? So this is one of those things that you kind of look at and you go, that doesn't make sense. And so when you design your programs, though, you can use this by trying to make it seem, how are you making that so that it is more appropriate or more fit with your specific individuals. The more customized that you can make it, the better that is. Goal gradient theory. Real simple. This is basically saying that, the closer you get to a goal, the more motivated you are by it. Illusionary goal progress is saying even if that goal motivation increases, even when that progress towards the goal is illusionary. One of my favorite studies is this. So research to buy 10 coffees and get one free, right? So you get a card, 10 punches, you get a free coffee. So Rand, again, same gentleman that did the last one, he did this where he said, all right, here's this 10, you get a 10 punch, average of 15.6 days to redeem that, right? Here he did one where he said, hey, it's a buy 12 but to get one free, but it started off, you got 2 when you got handed to you, 2 of them were punched. So you still had 10 coffees to buy. But it was an average of 12.7 days. And they've done this multiple different times, so this wasn't just one study. Basically, this fact of saying, hey, you're already having progress towards the goal is a motivating component to say you're already there, you're already started, and actually gets people their behavior, changes their behavior. Again, economically speaking, rationally, it's 10 and 10. It shouldn't make any difference. But there's this perception that you're already making progress towards the goal, and when you're making progress towards the goal, you're doing it. There's a big thing, they call it the laws of, instead of Newton's laws of motion, right, there's the law of motivation. And the biggest piece is to get people started, right? It's that initial, it's that first step. Once you get people in that first step, motivation gets a lot going. This is like taking that first step forward. All right, perceived fairness. Again, people are perceived, or fairness is a big component of motivation. Not from the perspective of saying being fair is going to really motivate me, right? Nobody's going to say a fair program is going to be more motivational than is going to be a great motivator for me. The lack of motivation, though, can be a real big downfall. And so fairness seems a bit like here. Its absence is a lot more noticeable than its presence. One of those really great quotes. Here's a really great, so has anybody heard of the ultimatum game? No. Ultimatum game is this. Basically, you have 2 people. One person gets a set of money. Usually it's around $10. They've done it up with $100 to $1,000, various different denominations. That person then has to give some portion of that $10 to another person. That person says yes or no to that. There's no negotiation. They just get to say, yes, I accept your offer, or no, I don't. If they say yes, everybody gets the money and how it's split. If they say no, nobody gets any money. What do you think the minimum amount is for somebody to, on average, for people to accept? Anybody? $2, $5, $3? 2? Anybody else?
4.
4?
1.
1? So economically speaking, if somebody, a rational person, if somebody offered you a penny, you should accept. Because you're a penny better than you were before. A dime, right? $1. Typically it has to be greater than or equal to $3, about 30%. Even when you get up to $1,000, and it was somebody offered you, all right, I got $1,000 to split, I'm going to give you $150, people will actually decline that offer. They'll refuse $150 just to penalize the person because they feel it's not fair. And some people have done it, I mean, they do it up to $400 where they're offered $400, they're going, that's not fair, I need an equal split. So just some applications kind of going over that. I won't go into those, but again, ensure the event end is positive, highlight and use testimonials from that social proof. So again, lots of really interesting pieces on that. Build rules and programs to feel as custom as possible, make that idiosyncratic fit. Show progress to the goal, even if you can get a fast start, build a fast start to a program, various different things, and ensure that it's perceived as fair. And the big word there is perceived. It doesn't matter if it's in reality fair, it's the perception of fairness. And so you got to make sure that you do that really good. Questions on any of that stuff? I'm going to talk about communication here real quick. So, real quick, framing. People react differently to a particular choice or option based on how it is presented. In other words, is it a loss or a gain, certainty or uncertainty, etc. So, there was a research that was done that had basically, it was for a Ph.D. program. They said, hey, you get a discount if you register before August 1st. So they sent out 2 notices. One notice said, hey, there's a penalty if you register after August 1st of 15%. The other one went out and said, hey, there's a discount if you register before August 1st. So again, same amount of money, same cost before or after for each of them. So it shouldn't really make any difference. Right? But the percent of registration, so when it was framed as a penalty, 93% of the people that got that notification registered early, registered before August 1st, versus 67% when it was registered as a discount. And there's a component called loss aversion. So loss aversion is a component that says, hey, as people, $100 gain versus $100 loss. The pleasure that I receive from finding $100 on the ground, right? I get a certain amount of pleasure from that. But it's about half as much as the pain that I feel if all of a sudden I open up my wallet and go, $100 is missing that I had. So it's typically about double. Now, so that doesn't always mean that you always think, target things or frame things as a loss, right? You don't necessarily do that, but sometimes it's really important, particularly if you're thinking about a rewards program, recognition program, or different things where you're talking about, can you frame something as, think about what you can gain in 2018 versus don't leave money on the table in 2018. Very different reactions from people and how that can be used. So you got to make sure you frame that component there correctly. Cognitive overload. This is short-term memory, various different things. Again, we get overloaded with stuff. Our brains actually stop processing. We fall back to our heuristics and our biases that we have. And so, if you're trying to communicate program rules or how you win, or even just an educational component about a new process or program, you don't want to get too much information. Now, we have an ability to chunk things together. And so the way that something is visually represented can change that. So even the same amount of information, right? This was an actual component where they had all these different elements there. If you actually change it to visually represent it, it changes that. So again, think about how you are communicating and how much information you're communicating and how that's visually represented. And then anchoring. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but people use any information as a reference for evaluating or estimating unknown value or new information. We get anchored in on things. And so again, part of this is really interesting. So Dan Ariely, who wrote Predictably Irrational, if anybody hasn't read it, it's a really good book on behavioral economics. But he talks about this, where research the estimate. He asked a group of people to estimate the price of a wireless keyboard after writing down the last 2 digits of your social security number expressed as a dollar amount. So just the last 2 digits, right? So if you had social security ended in 74, you write down $74. And then he had them, right after that, say, all right, so estimate how much you think this wireless keyboard would cost. That was when wireless keyboards were brand new. People didn't really have an idea of what it would be. What's really interesting is if you were if you had a social security number that ended with 80 or 90 or somewhere in there, you estimated that cost of the keyboard at $56. you were in the bottom 20%, you estimated that keyboard at $16. Same keyboard, same thing, only difference was, hey, you wrote down a number that had absolutely no relevance to the cost of that keyboard beforehand. And they've done this with different things too, about this and estimating the number of countries in Africa and a variety of other things. It holds true across many different things. But we get anchored in on different things. And the important part about this from a motivational perspective, and specifically from a behavior perspective, is what is the culture that you're driving, or the culture that you have, what is that anchored in on? What are the behaviors that you're anchoring in from that culture perspective? So what do people, when they join the organization, get anchored in on, this is how we do it? Because it's really hard to change once that anchor is on it. And so make sure that when you're working with things that you're trying to anchor the positive behaviors that you're doing. Questions on that? Yeah? No? So again, just some applications, frame communication accordingly. Didn't talk about normative and descriptive, present versus future, but there's all different components of this as you're thinking about how you're doing this. Simplify content to graphically drive behaviors and communicate optimal performance.
Thanks, Kurt. That was really exceptional. Thank you. I really appreciate it.